So everybody, it is good to see you here. And I have been looking forward to this for a very long time. And Petit, many of you know, but not all of you know, that she is somebody who studied Talmud, Tanakh, and Halacha at the Drisha Institute. And this was an institute that focused, a specific program that focused on classical Jewish texts and advanced women's learning at the highest level. And she graduated from the Drisha's flagship scholar circle in 2013. She's taught Talmud, prayer book, Hebrew, and other Jewish topics at synagogues and community institutions in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. She also holds a Juris Doctor degree from Fordham University School of Law and is a retired attorney. So we're delighted that you're offering this program on Written in the Stars, Jews and Astrology today, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is going to be approximately an hour long, maybe a little longer. Trying to build in some time for questions. In screen share mode, I cannot see everybody on my screen, so it's helpful to do something like use the hand raise function, which pops you up onto my screen. I'll try to take some questions along the way, pause a couple of times at key points for people to digest and offer insights and ask questions. The topic, as we know, is Written in the Stars, Jews and Astrology. And this is a topic which at the same time makes a lot of sense and makes no sense at all. Why would we be ascribing any kind of powers to the stars when we've been explicitly told that we're not to be involved with things like that? Well, it's a little complicated. Babylonian astrology is the earliest known system of astrology, and there's evidence of the beginnings of this as far back as 2000 before the Common Era, 4,000 years ago, in other words. This is an early tablet in the script that was used at the time. And it has various representations of the different divisions of the zodiac and their trines off to the left there. The Babylonian gods had planets assigned to them. For example, the god Marduk is Jupiter, Ishtar is Venus, and so on. And the astrological system was one of two ways the Babylonian priesthood used to divine the will of the gods, the other being divination through the organs of sacrificed animals. By the year 1600, before the Common Era, the system of astrology had been compiled in a reference known as the Numa Anu Enlil, 70 cuneiform tablets with about 7,000 different celestial omens that they had noticed. Unfortunately, we know of this only from later sources. There haven't been any original tablets of it uncovered. These things are, of course, very rare because they're very breakable. And there's a certain amount of this gets discovered in archeological digs from time to time. But of course, it's a very small portion of what was produced by that society. So this was not a very sophisticated system because the ancient Babylonians simply didn't have enough knowledge of practical astronomy to predict future planetary and celestial positions. They could only try to ascribe meaning to what they were seeing, and that didn't become central to their astrology until about the 4th century BCE, by which time the ancient world as a whole had developed a good deal of knowledge of the regular movements of planets and celestial objects, or the apparent movements of them, since of course nobody had any idea that the Earth was revolving around the sun. They thought everything was revolving around the Earth. Along the way, animals became associated with some of the constellations of the zodiac, and some of those same animals are still in use today. For example, the sheep or the ram for Aries, the bull for Taurus, the crab for Cancer, the lion for Leo, the goat for Capricorn. And some of the Babylonian names for the constellations themselves stuck as well. Gemini was the twin, Libra was the balance, Scorpio was the scorpion. That seems to be a constant through all of the astrological systems that were devised. There's something like a scorpion at about that time of year, and it always has something to do with war and pestilence. Lovely, that's my sign. Pisces was the tails, which may evoke the pair of fish that we associate with it now. Sometime after the fall of the Babylonian Empire to Persia, in 539 BCE, Babylonian astronomers devised the system of the ecliptic as we know it today, as the sun's movement or apparent movement, as seen from the Earth against the backdrop of the stars through the year, divided into 12 constellations, covering 30 degrees of the sky apiece, and this concept spread throughout the ancient world. So the exile of the Jews into Babylonia, 586 BCE, and many remaining thereafter, overlapped that period, as did the Persian conquest of Babylonia. So Jews resident in Babylonia were exposed to astrological beliefs and influences from the very beginning of their time there, as part of the society that surrounded them. By the ascendance of the Jewish sages during the Sasanian Empire period, the Sasanian ruling circles were translating astrological works from Greece and India and incorporating them into the existing Babylonian influence practice. They also worked to establish a scientific system of astronomy. Those two grew up beside each other. Of course, they're very closely related. And it's even very difficult at times to tell apart when some treatise is oriented toward astronomy and when it's oriented toward astrology, the movement of or apparent movement of planets and celestial objects, predicting future movements of them, predicting what those movements might mean. That all went together very closely. So the religion of the Persian rulers, Zoroastrianism, is a monotheistic faith, and it was very comfortable for the emerging sages to work within that framework. There were actually many areas in common, including a concern with things like ritual purity. So they really got along quite well together for the most part. The Zoroastrians had no problem whatsoever with allowing astrology's influence of the sun and stars and the planets to play a significant role in the life of humanity. And that was the background against which they were functioning. But let's go back to the very beginning of our identity as the Jewish people. The ancient Israelites probably weren't outside the influence of astrology either, both through contact with the surrounding ancient world and through exposure in Egypt, which originally had a 36-unit ecliptic, but later adopted the Greco-Roman 12-unit ecliptic that we know. Alexander the Great, of course, conquered Egypt and brought a lot of those influences, so that there was a much more unified system of astrology that took root throughout the whole region. The idea that the stars had some kind of power over the doings of humans was likely known to them. While the Torah doesn't discuss this subject extensively, it does make a few things in that regard pretty clear. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. That's, of course, part of the Decalogue. And then there's this in Deuteronomy. When you look up to the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These the Lord your God allotted to other peoples everywhere under heaven. But you, the Lord, took and brought out of Egypt that iron blast furnace to be his very own people, as is now the case. So there arose from the Torah an idea that planets and the stars was for other people, for them and not for you, and that the various stars and planets could have all the influence they want as God's intermediaries in regards to the other nations of the world, but we got to deal with God directly, and that was part of what it meant to be a chosen people, that there were no intermediaries standing between us and God. We had prophets, we had Moses, basically because we insisted, but at least at Sinai, we had the possibility of being in direct communication with God. So a long period goes by about which we don't know very much about everyday Jewish life, except from the text of the Bible itself. It mentions astrological subjects from time to time, especially in later books like Daniel, toward the end of the biblical period. But as we draw closer to the Common Era, we start to have a little more information. The Talmudic sages first emerged in Eretz Israel, where the first Hellenistic and later Roman influence ensured that astrology was part of the popular culture, pretty much in the form that we know it now. Very similar ideas got traded back and forth all around the ancient world. It helped that Greece and Rome at their respective times conquered so very much of the ancient world, modified from the Babylonian system into the one that we know pretty much today. It was part of the popular discourse. It appeared in art and civic architecture. It made its way even into synagogues. So why did the sages tolerate this? They really didn't have the power to stop it. They were a very small group. They mostly functioned in their own circles. They were striving to create a vision of continued Jewish functioning after the destruction of the Second Temple. But they were more of a think tank than anything that had much of an influence on the everyday life of the Jewish community. Jews, for the most part, read the Torah, tried the best they could to do what it said, got used to the idea that the temple wasn't around, hoped for its reconstruction, revolted when that didn't seem to be happening. But all in all, the sages did not have that much effect on any of it, regardless of the way they tried to portray this later. So David Kramer wrote a very interesting book a couple of years ago called The History of the Talmud. It's very readable and really excellent. And he said, overall, it is fair to say that nowhere in Palestine did the rabbis exercise any bona fide control over the commercial, religious, or private lives of Jews. Inherited Jewish beliefs and customs based upon scripture or tradition and not upon rabbinic interpretation or legislation would have persisted as well. Again, synagogues constructed in the 5th and 6th centuries stand as clear testimony to the state of affairs just described. The decorative schemes of these synagogues, replete as they are with zodiacs, along with images of Helios or other pagan images, would never have been tolerated by rabbis if they had any real authority. In fact, nothing in these synagogues suggests any rabbinic power or even presence until the 6th or 7th century. So here's a picture from the Beit Alpha synagogue. Here you can see some of the more general context, and you can see that this right smack in the center of the floor is this depiction of the zodiac. Okay, fine, it's cute. It's interesting that they're using actual depictions of people and animals and so on. Herodian architecture did none of that. Herodian architecture, which was more influenced by the Sadducees, who were running the temple at that point, who were biblical literalists, had no, it was almost more Islamic. It did not have depictions of actual, a lot of sort of flower shapes, but very geometrical and not actual depictions of living things at all. So here's a close-up of this, and you can see in the center of it, this is a depiction of the Greek god Helios with the standard chariot and 4 horses, an image that is not unknown from, say, the book of Revelation at the end of the Christian gospel, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Well, there's the 4 horses anyway, and there's Helios driving the chariot. Now, whether this might be co-opted as a depiction of something like Ezekiel's ascent in the chariot, it may have appealed to people on that level, or maybe it's just so popular an image that nobody would question it. But clearly none of the sages was on the building committee in Beit Alpha. So Anybody have any comments or questions that they'd like to interject at this point?
I wish you'd been on the tour when we went around and saw this in Israel, because I don't think people quite said it like that. It's
Yeah, I would have loved to have been on that too. I don't think we were at Beit Alpha. I think we were more, I think it was Satori that the tour I was on went to, but there was a very similar synagogue floor there. And this was just very common all over northern Israel where these synagogues were built. Really reflective of the general culture around.
And I suspect what you're saying about the sages weren't around for the building committee is probably very correct. Not sure about the dating of this, but that talk that I did a couple of years ago on the Dura Europos synagogue really goes back, that city goes back to 300 BCE, and they had all kinds of images, of biblical accounts done in mosaics. So the whole idea of illustration was really very independent, and it was in a city that had a church which was hidden. There was a synagogue. There was all kinds of other religious groups there at the same time. It was a very cosmopolitan place. So there was probably a lot of independence because they were living amongst a whole mixture of cultures, and they each got along.
Yeah, it was very true. I mean, sometimes the Christians were hideously oppressed by the Romans, and sometimes they were advanced by the Romans, and the Romans started oppressing others. But that was more as you got later, after 350-ish CE, after the conversion of Constantine, that's when those kinds of things really started to happen. Before then, as long as you were not revolting against Roman authority, they really didn't care what you did. They had a whole bunch of gods. What was a couple more?
And I think probably a whole lot has to do with the timeline of scriptural canonizations.
Yeah, and
because prior to that, it was free for all.
Yeah, and while we had a canonized Bible more or less by that time, sometimes it was more and sometimes it was less, and there was a whole lot of writing kind of surrounding the Bible, the pseudepigraphia and different works that did not become canonical in the Tanakh, but did, for example, in Christian versions of the Bible, were all being written after about 200 BCE, after the close of what we consider the era of the Tanakh. And a lot of these works really kind of were written in biblical style and were reworkings of different biblical books, including the Torah. And there wasn't really a clear dividing line. This is what we do and this is not what we do. There was a huge competition of ideas going on then. And the Beit Alpha synagogue is dated to something like 600 CE. So it was kind of toward the end of the era in which Jewish life was really flourishing in Eretz Israel. Things really started to go downhill after that. There were earthquakes and famines and plagues, and really destroyed Jewish life in Israel after about that point.
There's an interesting component there for me. I think this is just so beautiful, and that really adds a lot for me, seeing that kind of beauty.
Yes. Clearly, somebody went to a lot of trouble to lay this floor. It's a very complicated process. It's kind of a lost wax process. They would fasten it to boards with wax, turn the boards over, pour boiling water over it to melt the wax. Then you had to pick up the boards, you had to adjust the tesserae, then you had to grout it. It was very complicated. And you had to be able to lay it on the board backwards so that it would come out. So you really had to have quite an artistic sense to envision what this was going to look like, because in some ways you were going about it blind. So the Talmudic era In neither version of the Talmud do the sages talk very much about the Beit Knesset or the synagogue. Their affairs centered on the Beit Midrash, the house of study. So they hung out and they studied and they prayed in their Beit Midrash, their own little clubhouse, in their own circles, and they really didn't hang out in the synagogues with the general rabble. They weren't on the board, they weren't on the building committee, and there was no such thing as the rabbi of the shul. That just did not exist as a concept, not for a long time to come. So Eretz Israel, as we mentioned, during the Second Temple period and after the destruction of the Second Temple, was a stew of competing ideas. The cultural backdrop was thoroughly Greco-Roman. In fact, from the time of Alexander the Great right through the 7th century of the Common Era, with only about 100 years of the Hasmonean dynasty to separate them, those two empires had control of the region. Greek was commonly spoken by ordinary people along with Aramaic. The Hebrew of the Eretz Israel sages was the language that they made up. It was not something that was spoken. It was not biblical Hebrew. Rabbinic Hebrew was of their own devising. And a lot of it just went straight into modern Hebrew when modern Hebrew was devised, because it's a very clear and relatively simple rendition of the language with a simplified grammar from what you see in the Torah. It really worked very well, but it was their own thing. It was their own little code language. You had to be a member of the club to know this. So to understand, say, the Mishnah, you had to be part of this group of sages. You had to be a student in one of their circles. And as I mentioned, they did not meet in the synagogue. The Christian Gospels were written in Greek. You could even read the Torah and Megillah in Greek, and that would be kosher. One concession that the early rabbis made to the way that things were was to allow the key works, and yes, the Megillah was for them a very key work, allow these to be written and read in Greek. And then that was the only language that everybody agreed you could do this in. Some allowance made for hearing the Megillah in your own language, but it never really became a practice to actually do that. Latin was an upper class language. Dress in general, along with architecture and civic organization, was more Roman inspired. But to those who were truly serious about religion, the general political tension generated by the Roman takeover of the land and effectively the government in 63 BCE gave rise to any number of attempts to explain why God's country had fallen under the dominion of outsiders. This wasn't supposed to happen. God had made all these promises. What was going on? What had gone wrong? So Shia J.D. Cohen, in his book From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, has this to say: many Jews of the Second Temple period thought that the actions of individuals, no less than those of nations, were to some degree at least predetermined by God. It was a huge debate at that time. These Jews were influenced by the belief in astrology, which swept the entire Hellenistic world in the 3rd century BCE, or were disturbed by the idea that God could so distance himself from the world as to allow humans the freedom to do whatever they please. Like they had this, either everything was being predetermined by God, in which case, there's no free will at all, or it's a free-for-all. Everybody does their own thing. There was very little sense of balance there, and people were trying to get all this to work together. According to Josephus, the Essenes, in contrast to the Sadducees, declared fate is mistress of all things, and nothing befalls men unless it be in accordance with her decree. Yet the Pharisees said certain events are the work of fate, but not all. As to other events, it depends upon ourselves whether they shall take place or not. So they were kind of the middle ground. Josephus's use of the term fate, in Greek, he marmene, I'm not an expert in Greek, I don't know if I said that right or not, probably reflects this idea of predeterminism. The Essenes claimed all human actions are determined by fate, while the Pharisees claimed that life is governed jointly by fate and free will. Now, the Pharisees, of course, were the intellectual forebears of the sages. In Hebrew, they were called the Perushim, the ones who were separate, they were the ones who picked out of the Torah all of the different rules for living and tried to actually live those rules, and then tried to start working those into a system by which Jews could live their lives, a project that, of course, took on great urgency after the temple was destroyed. So this is a small piece of description of this tumultuous era. And the early sages were willing to accept that astrological concepts had something to do with what befell a given person. But the question then was, to what extent? I mean, this is, bear in mind, this is taken for granted the way we take it for granted now that the earth revolves around the sun. The fact that all of these influences existed was just quote unquote scientific fact for that time. Something that you really had to grapple with if you were going to have any kind of discussion about the Odyssey or about the free will or any of these philosophical topics. So clearly this idea that the constellations, Mazal, should have any say over our fate when God is supposed to be all powerful was hard for the sages to swallow. It's as good a time as any to ask right now, what does everybody here think that Mazal Tov or Mazel Tov actually means? Ever given any thought to what that actually means?
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. Good stars. Wishing you to have good stars for whatever endeavor you're undertaking that we're all happy about. So, this got changed into good luck or congratulations. But that was actually the origin of that. I taught a version of this to a women's Torah group that I teach. And I actually had titled it Mazal Tov, and nobody got it. Why was a class on astrology being called Mazal Tov? I thought everyone would get this, and nobody did. So this is so ingrained into us that we don't even stop to think what that actually means.
Well, at what point did that change? I mean, at what point did we lose that significance of it being stars?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We will get to that in as we go along here. This was a very popular idea until the time came when it was not so popular, and we'll see that process unfold. So the planets and the stars are supposed to be for other people, supposedly. This is what the Torah told us, and this is what explanations of the Torah that we had told us. There was midrash about this. So what are we doing wondering about the stars and the planets for? So the views of the sages were closest to those of the Pharisees, as I mentioned. They're our ideological forebears. And the sages of the Talmud debated the extent of the influence of the stars pretty fiercely. Astrology was all around them. It's being practiced in every alleyway, being written into amulets that even the sages believed had efficacy, especially in Babylonia, where the Persians and Jews alike were wearing these amulets. Most of these were written on parchment or paper and kept in cases that were often made of leather. We don't have a lot of physical evidence of them. Outside of textual accounts, I was able to find a number of examples of amulets that were made of lead or other metals like that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find pictures of any that were actually found in situ. And given the track record of Israeli archaeology, most of the stuff that is not recovered in situ, like from the actual strata of the ground in which it, in which an actual archaeologist uncovers it, it's likely to be fake. So I didn't bother with it because I just have no idea that that's even real. But writing amulets was a lively cottage industry throughout the region. So how do we explain what's going on? There are some possible amulet texts, by the way, from Qumran, and I could not find any pictures of those either, but I have read that they exist. But some of the little scraps that were found in those deposits of the Dead Sea Scrolls were amulet texts. Some of them even written on the back of other things. So for that matter, what good should an amulet do? You know, you're wearing this thing and it's protecting you against, you know, whatever it was written to protect you against, but why should that even be so? If the sages approved of these so highly that as long as an amulet was written by an expert, you were allowed to wear it in the public domain in Shabbat. You're not supposed to carry in the public domain on Shabbat. You know, if it's jewelry, that's okay, but amulets were not considered jewelry. Maybe if you had a decorative enough case that you're still carrying the text of the amulet in it, which isn't necessarily kosher. It's not like they could really stop anybody from doing this because their influence wasn't much greater in Babylonia than it was in Eretz Israel, where, by the way, people also wore amulets. But they explain that animals cannot wear an amulet out on Shabbat, and their explanation why is interesting. The master stated, and not with an amulet may an animal go out, even if it's written by an expert. Objection, but we've learned in a Mishnah, and not with an amulet that is not written by an expert. If it's written by an expert, it's fine. Here too, it means an amulet not written by an expert. So fine, an animal cannot go out and if it's wearing an amulet that's not written by an expert. But it teaches here that an animal may not go out even if it's wearing an amulet that is written by an expert. And well, that may mean an expert for a person, but not an expert for an animal. Maybe you have to have special experts for animals. And is there such a thing as an expert for a person who would not be an expert for an animal? And then they get down to the actual nafkamina, the practical difference between people and animals in this regard. Yes, for a person who has a mazal, it is effective for him. For an animal that does not have a mazal, or a mazla, as it's written here, mazala, it is not effective for it. So the stars have some influence over us. So amulets can have some protective effect, but animals are not in that particular universe. And so it doesn't do any good to hang an amulet on an animal, and therefore the animal is just carrying it on Shabbat, and that's not legal. So Rashi says, he has a different version of this. Mazleh, his angel who advocates for him. Now Rashi, of course, lived in 10th century France, part of Ashkenaz in the broader sense, which of course was a Christian area, and guardian angels are quite a Christian concept. And since we seem to soak up influences from the world around us very naturally, that idea blended with previously existing Jewish ideas about angels who had dominion over various things into this concept of you have this angel who advocates for you. Mazla, the word used in the Gemara, is just Aramaic for mazal, a star or perhaps a constellation. Mazle, which Rashi had in his version, is the Hebrew possessive of mazal. So this shifted this concept from a particular star configuration having dominion of some kind to each person having a star, being under a star, born under a star, a concept that, we still have in, kind of popular sayings, even if we don't take it very seriously. Astrology wasn't really a thing at the time that Rashi was alive. He was at the time in Europe that was just emerging from the Dark Ages, in which all of those lovely Greco-Roman things had basically been forgotten in most of Europe. But this idea got transmuted into a concept that's more like a guardian angel. Part of the Talmud text here is actually a Jastrow jackpot for the definition of mazla. If you look it up in a Jastrow dictionary, this wonderful, huge, confusing thing that you use to study Gemara with, they'll give examples in which the word is used, and this is the example from Jastrow, from mazla, and it's translated right there as guardian angel, probably based on this Rashi. So while clearly Jews knew about mazal from the Talmud and related sources, they didn't live within a culture that stressed it, so they kind of smooshed in these influences from the world that did surround them. then you add to this the idea that the heavenly court is always in session and always weighing your merits and demerits, and you need the best possible lawyer at all times, or you could perhaps get thrown to the stars. So maybe an amulet served as a kind of retainer agreement in that context. Who knows? Keep that angel working for you. So in the following passage, the sages manage to conclude that the stars have no power over Israel, except when they do. Maybe, in fact, there's a very clever division of labor that they envision here. So this is also from Shabbat, later in the tractate. It was stated, Rabbi Hanina says, one's constellation, Mazal, determines intelligence. It determines wealth, and there is a constellation for Israel. Yesh Mazal Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan says there is no constellation for Israel. And he follows his own reasoning from elsewhere. For Rabbi Yochanan said, from where we know that there is no constellation for Israel, the scripture says, thus says the Lord, do not adopt the ways of the nations and do not fear the signs of the heavens, for the nations fear them. The nations should fear them, not Israel. Rav too holds that there's no constellation for Israel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, from where do we know that there's no constellation for Israel? Scripture says, Genesis, and he took him, Abraham, outside and said, gaze toward the heavens and count the stars. Abraham said before the Holy One of blessing, ask for the universe. And this is midrash. This is not from the text of the Torah. Whenever you see this Rabbanu Shel Olam stuff, it is midrash. I have consulted my astrology, stagnant, perhaps a horoscope, and I am not fit to father a son. The Holy One said to him, emerge from your astrology. Come out from under that. There is no constellation for Israel. What do you suppose? Because Jupiter, in whose hour Abraham was supposedly born, was in the west, rendering him likely to be infertile, according to the astrological wisdom of the day. I will move it around and place it in the east. And that is the meaning of the verse from Isaiah, who awoke Tzedek, the word for Jupiter, what it's called in Hebrew, from the east. He summoned it because of him, Abraham. So here they got an entire verse from elsewhere in the Bible to support this notion that God said, fooey on that, I'll just put it somewhere else and your mazal will be different. I'm the one who determines mazal. I move all these things around. I'm the one who does that. So there isn't any mazal that's having any direct effect on you. I'm just playing billiards up there with the stars. So we'll see more of this piece of midrash. So we have another example. Shmuel's experience. We learned this, that there is no constellation for Israel. So Shmuel and Avlate, a Gentile astrologer, were sitting together, and some men were going to a swamp to cut reeds. Avlate said to Shmuel, that man will go but not come back, for a snake will bite him and he will die. Shmuel replied, if he is a Jew, he will go and return. While they were sitting there, the man went and returned. Avlate arose and threw down the man's reeds. He found in them a snake that had been cut in two. Shmuel asked the man, what did you do? He said, every day we put our bread together into one basket and eat it. Today one of us did not have any bread, and he was becoming embarrassed. I said to them, I will get up and collect the bread. When I reached the man, I acted as though I were taking something from him, so that he should not be embarrassed. Shmuel said to him, you have done a good deed, a mitzvah. Shmuel went out and expounded, charity saves from death. This verse from Proverbs, figures into the stories that the sages tell on this point, that our deeds can actually have an effect on something that appears to have been foreordained. So Rabbi Akiva, there's a story from Rabbi Akiva as well that goes to illustrate this point, that there's no constellation for Israel. Rabbi Akiva had a daughter. The Chaldeans, astrologers, told him, the day she enters her bridal chamber, a snake will bite her and she will die. He was greatly disturbed at this. On her wedding day, she took her brooch and stuck it into the wall. It happened that when she did this, the pin stuck a snake in the eye and killed it. In the morning, when she took the brooch out of the wall, the dead snake followed, stuck to the brooch. Her father asked her, what did you do? She replied, in the afternoon, a pauper came and called from the doorway, and guess who that is, right? Eliyahu Hanavi. Poor people and old men are always Eliyahu Hanavi. Everyone was busy at the banquet and no one heard him. I stood up and took my portion that had been given to me and I gave it to him. Rabbi Akiva said to her, "You have done a good deed." Rabbi Akiva went out and expounded, "Charity saves from death." And he said, that's not just figurative death. That's actual death, he said, because it had happened in his own household. So the idea that although the stars might tell us general things about ourselves and our future, even though that might be the case, good deeds and timely appeals to the Almighty can infinitely alter this. This saved the sages from an all-out culture kampf against the surrounding society, a war they would never have won. So this kind of forced them to find a viewpoint of moderation. They could remain isolated and pure in their beliefs that none of this had anything to do with the Jews, or they could take account of the fact that, of course, they had no way of explaining a lot of what went on in the world around them anyway, science being in the non-state that it was at that time. We didn't have germ theory. We didn't have any of those kinds of explanations for why things happen to people. It was always as good as the next one. You could take account of that and try to work it into a system that people can at least get a hold of. So let's have a pause here and see if anyone has any comments or questions that they'd like to ask here. Been a lot of stuff, I know.
Yeah, I have some questions. I mean, we're talking about various ways of preventing evil from happening. I come from, my mother's side from Eastern Europe, and there was lots of talk about, evil eye and ways in which to avert that, but not until I was grown that I realized that the Israelis or the Eastern or Sephardic Jews, have picked up the Hamsa, and that's a protective shield, and that was not ever in my education. It was a big surprise that you have this kind of amulet. They're beautiful. I mean, I originally saw them, I think it was in Turkey or Morocco, and then in Israel.
And a lot of that is the Babylonian influence, because there was a very highly developed demonology in Persia, Babylonia, in those parts of the world. And that got incorporated straight into the rabbinic Judaism of the Talmud Bavli, which of course then became the Talmud that sort of won the Betamax VHS Talmud war, and became the dominant version of the Talmud. So demonology worked its way into Jewish practice in Europe as well, and of course in the Eastern branches of Judaism, very much so. And it's kind of the cousin to this discussion. If you're not going to have stars interfering in your life, well, there's always demons who could do much the same thing. Might be an interesting topic for another day. They even had a demon called Seltrek, whose job it was to tangle up long curly hair at night. So when you were spending hours the next day trying to get the knots out of your hair, you can always blame little Seltrek for doing this.
No tooth fairy?
Yeah, well, who knew? It was probably a demon that causes your teeth to rot. There seemed to be, the sages described things that there's so many demons that they cause the robes of scholars to wear out. That you could do a certain spell involving the ashes from, I think it was a placenta of a black cat whose mother was a black cat. You burn this and scatter the ash by your bed, and then you can see the demon tracks in the morning. It's all kinds of wacky stuff about demons in the Talmud.
So a lot of people wear a Star of David around, from a necklace around their neck. And I always thought that was just an expression of Jewish pride. And it sounds to me like you're saying it's probably a lot more than that, and it descended from the stars being protective in some way.
Well, that actually is even, I think, closer to demonology than to astrology. King Solomon supposedly had a ring, and that was his signet, this Star of David. It's the 6-pointed star. And it originated actually with him. It didn't really come into wide Jewish usage until the 15th or 16th century. We started seeing it in places like Prague. I think is where it first started showing up in architecture. But it had more to do with this ring apparently gave him power over the demon king. And that was maybe more where that shape came into practice. Supposedly you could draw this on the ground and then surround it with a rope, and by saying the proper incantations you could force the demon king to appear within that circle. I mean, there were all kinds of wacky stuff like that. But the fact that it's a star, yeah, there's probably some crossover there as well. Anyone else?
This reminds me just the story that you have up right now, just a little bit of the kind of general feeling of utashuva, utafila, usadaka, like things that could be happening. We still have some human agency over it, in this case, sadaka.
Yeah, this whole idea of heavenly decrees. You know, if there's going to be heavenly decrees, is there some way that we can maybe get some idea of what these are? And, you know, sure, there were mystical ways of finding out, you know, entering into the chamber and hiding behind the throne and hearing these things being decreed. Or on Erev Rosh Hashanah, going to the cemetery and you might get lucky and hear the recent dead discussing them, that sort of thing. Yeah, there is a story to that effect in the Talmud as well. But if you can maybe look at the heavens and sort of divine what that might be, you can maybe prepare. Or you could just simply have the idea that if I'm a good enough person, you know, my guardian angel, my mazal, will get up and advocate for me before the heavenly court and annul that or avert the severity of it. Or in the more modern working of this, the way that we perceive the things that are happening to us, we can work on that and perceiving it in other ways that will help us to emerge from it and for it to have a less devastating effect on us. However one wants to look at that. But of course, all of those kind of philosophical and theological aspects of this had a long way to go to develop to the point where we know them today. And heaven knows that this is still something that we can discuss endlessly. And we pretty much do every year. That's part of what the Elul and the high holiday period are for. The time every year to think about those things. So
Is there
you can
is there a fine line between treating things like the mezuzah on the doorpost as an amulet versus, you know, a remembrance of God, or because it's in Torah, and also just ritualistic behavior as a way of kind of magically using it in a sort of magical sense, you know?
that often happens in every religious tradition, regardless of the efforts of spiritual leaders to discourage that. It does happen. Say, yeah, there is a line there. We can become educated in what our religious tradition says about these things, you know, as aids to remember the sanctity of God, or the fact that our house is a mikdash me'at, a little temple, or you know, any of those things that a mezuzah might do for us, versus ascribing some magical power to the mezuzah itself. And yes, there was a lot of belief about changing the mezuzahs if someone in the house was ill, and that maybe that would have some protective effect. Certainly, it's very easy to fall into that. And it's especially easy to fall into it at a time when you don't have any better explanation.
So I'm thinking about the blood on the doorposts to keep the angel of death away. Is that somehow related? Is it
Well, the
protector?
The Torah did instruct that to happen, and I think that in the context of that first Pesach, where God was going to Pesach, pass over those houses, that this was the way that the Israelites had to opt in. Their Midrash tells us that there were quite a lot of Israelites who, in fact, did not get out of Egypt and who died on that night because they couldn't be bothered. They were not going to opt into this. They had fallen so far into the pit of despair that they were lost to the people. And that those who did make this effort and put up that blood and make themselves obvious to the Egyptians by doing that with an animal, nonetheless, that was holy to the Egyptians, it was really saying something. It was a big opt-in, something that we had to do in order to bring about our own liberation, that we had to be partners in that. Much more than a superstitious thing, it was an actual overt act that said, we are going to go out. We are going to take you up, God, on this and go out. So one thing that we can note about these passages that we read, that some of the sages listed in it are from Eretz Israel, Rabbi Hanana and Rabbi Akiva. Some of them were from Bagel, Rav and Shmuel. And although the Talmud depicts the sages as the authority on the practice of Judaism, they were, as we noted, a small minority in both places. And Rabbinic Judaism didn't gain ascendancy until the close of the Talmudic era, after 600 CE, with the rise of the Gaonic academies in Babel, who then were answering everybody's questions from all over the world and were in fact big enough to act as a megaphone for these ideas. So rabbinic authority wasn't taken for granted until more like Rashi's lifetime. And even then, in other parts of the Jewish world, there was still a powerful non-rabbinite movement, the Karaites, who still in fact exist to some extent to this day, an entirely different tradition employing the same Torah that we do. So we also noted that in Rashi's time, no one in Northern Europe was that interested in astrology. The church was most definitely not interested in it. The Dark Ages were indeed very dark. The knowledge of the Greco-Roman era was largely lost and was not rediscovered again until another century or so after Rashi, when the Latin translation of works of Ptolemy were made, and the learned men of the church could at least begin to re-explore those ideas. Elsewhere in the Jewish world, the matter was a bit different. Although Islam is the most purely monotheistic of the Abrahamic faiths, and most authorities forbid the learning or practicing of astrology, there was still a lot of astrological influence through much of Islamic territory, simply because those lands had a native culture that was interested in such things. Even the prophet's own birth was credited among some early sources to a planetary conjunction. Rather like the birth of Jesus was heralded by this bright star that you could see in the daytime. There's got to be some portent in the skies for anything, really meaningful that happens on Earth. And they will make one up if they have to. And there's even, in fact, along the lines of making it up, there's a midrash about the birth of Abraham that, in fact, has a great star in the heavens heralding his birth. We mustn't forget, however, that Islamic scholars were extremely well versed in astronomy and in science and mathematics in general. They were the carriers of that knowledge after the quote unquote great Western civilization went back to living in wattle and daub huts and cooking over fires on the floor. In response to an inquiry from southern Spain, and against this backdrop of scientific flowering, Maimonides wrote a responsum on the proper place of astrology in Judaism. It's rather long, but it's worth going through, as it provides some pretty good advice for the present day as well. And I might mention before we get into that in the 7th century, Isidore of Seville, who was like the last scholar of the ancient world, he wrote an etymology of the science that he knew of, which is kind of the description. He lived in Spain, and he sort of knew about all of these Greco-Roman scientific authorities, and gave some kind of brief description of them. So the names were known, but not much of the actual things that the different, not much of the actual sciences as they stood. Pope Sylvester, who was the 10th century, Sylvester II had exposure to the works of Islamic scientific and philosophic inquiry. He came from Catalonia and introduced or reintroduced a form of abacus in Europe, probably without a zero. But he also embodied what little knowledge was still remembered, and possibly wrote actually the first astrological work of Europe right around the time that Rashi was born. But that was a thing of relatively minor impact. It's an interesting gap in European history of this kind of tradition. So Maimonides got this letter, answered it, and said, I perceive in this inquiry that although its boughs are many, they are all branches of a single tree, which is their common root, namely all the statements of the astrologers, the stargazers. Know, my masters, that it is not proper for a man to accept as trustworthy anything other than one of these three things. The first is a thing for which there is a clear proof deriving from man's reasoning, such as arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. He's trying to do something that really hasn't happened very much up till now, which is to tease out which of these things are really science and which of them are something else. These were all very smooshed together in the general way of thinking, in the parts of the world where they were deeply practiced. The second is a thing that a man perceives through one of the five senses, such as when he knows with certainty that this is red and this is black and the like through the sight of his eye. Whereas when he tastes that this is bitter and this is sweet, feels that this is hot, this is cold, he hears that a sound is clear, this sound is indistinct, or when he smells this is a pleasing smell, this is a displeasing smell. We're not going to get into how we would define pleasing and displeasing. There's no accounting for taste, but apparently for Rambam there was. The third is the thing that a man receives from the prophets or from the righteous. So received tradition. Every reasonable man ought to distinguish in his mind and thought all the things that he accepts as trustworthy and say, this I accept as trustworthy because of tradition, and this because of sense perception, and this on the grounds of reason. So sort out your knowledge. Anyone who accepts as trustworthy anything that is not of these three species, of him it is said, the simpleton believes everything. The thing about which most of the world errs, or all of it, save for a few individuals, the remnant of whom the Lord shall call, is that thing of which I am apprising you. The great sickness and the grievous evil consist in this, that all things that man finds written in books he presumes to think of as true, and all the more so if the books are old. You gotta love this guy. This is why our kingdom was lost and our temple was destroyed, and why we were brought to this. For our fathers sinned and are no more, because they found many books dealing with these themes of the stargazers. These things being the root of idolatry, as we have made clear in laws concerning idolatry. This was the Mishnah Torah, his great work, which if it weren't for Rashi, by the way, probably would leave us in a state where we wouldn't know much of anything about the Talmud. It would have displaced the Talmud. Just as the classical works were displaced for a long time because of the summary of them, that was written in Europe. No one bothered to go after the other stuff. They erred and were drawn after them, imagining them to be glorious science and to be of great utility. They did not busy themselves with the art of war or with the conquest of lands, but imagined that those studies would help them. He's completely making this up, by the way. Therefore, the prophets called them fools and dolts. And truly fools they were, for they walked after confused things that do not profit. They simply weren't prepared for the military power of the day. And, here was the whole thing. And it's always said that the the first temple was destroyed because everybody was involved in idol worship. And I'm sure that this is what Rambam is using this. Not only were they involved in idol worship, they were so busy gazing at the stars, trying to figure out, what they portended, that they didn't notice the army marching down on them, perhaps. So this is yet another reason why the temple was destroyed. And then, of course, the second temple was destroyed because everybody hated each other senselessly. Know, my masters, that I myself have investigated much into these matters. The first thing I studied is that science which is called judicial astrology. That is the science by which man may know what will come to pass in this world or in this or that city or kingdom, and what will happen to a particular individual all the days of his life. Horoscopes, in other words. Know, my masters, that every one of those things concerning judicial astrology, that its inherent adherents maintain, namely that something will happen one way and not another, and that the constellation under which one is born will draw him on, so that he will be of such and such a kind, and so that something will happen to him one way and not another. All those assertions are far from being scientific. They are stupidity. Tell it like it is, Rambam. There are lucid, faultless proofs refuting all the roots of those assertions. And of course, he goes on to give a whole bunch of them, which I'm not reproducing here. And know, my masters, that the science of the stars, that is genuine science, is knowledge of the form of the spheres, their number, their measure, the course they follow, each one's period of revolution, their declination to the north or to the south, their revolving to the east or to the west, and the orbit of every star and what its course is. Of course, none of them are orbiting, but nobody knew that then. On all of this and the like, the wise men of Greece, Persia, and India wrote compositions. This is an exceedingly glorious science. Now, inquiring after that was considered a wonderful thing, even if it was a bit of a distraction from Torah. Still, the sages had to say, that this is a good kind of Greek knowledge that is worthwhile. But this other stuff, not so much. Know that all the wise men of the Gentile nations, and they are the great philosophers, men of intellect and science, were all in accord that the world has a governor. He makes the sphere revolve, the sphere not revolving of itself. They have many books advancing a lucid proof for this. On this point, there is no controversy among men of science. Well, nowadays, of course, it's different. There is, however, a great controversy among them regarding this entire world, namely the sphere and what is beneath it. So here he makes a distinction between astrology and astronomy, the actual science of planetary and perceived astral movement, which of course had very practical uses for navigation and so on. And these were very poorly divided, as I noted, in the ancient world, and they spilled very easily into each other. And he's actually doing kind of a service by sort of teasing them out here. So the summary of the matter is that they maintain that what happens to each and everything, be it man or beast or tree or minerals, is all due to chance. But the being of all the species and the things comprehended in the entire world in which there is not the activity of a living soul, all of this stems from the power of the spheres, whose root in turn comes from the Holy One, blessed be he. So God moves the world around and the seasons happen and all of these other things happen as a result of what God is doing, not the stars themselves. The controversy lies in this, that the true religionists, and that is the religion of Moses, our teacher, maintain that what happens to individuals is not due to chance, but rather judgment. This is the root of the religion of Moses, our teacher, that everything happens to human beings is a just decree and judgment. Hence the sages maintain there is no death without sin and no affliction without transgression. Well, we would beg to differ, I think. This is, again, part of the great discussion that we constantly are having. No, we don't believe that God thinks you're being naughty, so God is going to afflict you with cancer. That's not how it works. On the other hand, they found it just about impossible to cope with the idea that blank happens. This was not something that they found acceptable.
And this is going a little fast for me. I'm assuming when you're saying Moses, you're talking about Maimonides?
Moses, our teacher, is Moses, our teacher.
Okay. But
Moses is Moses. One of the roots of the religion of Moses, which is Judaism.
So who's speaking?
This is still Maimonides writing.
Okay, all right. Because
as I said, it's long, but it's kind of worth going through because it has, at the same time, both ideas that we find completely unacceptable and ideas that are extremely modern.
Yes. Well, from what little reading I've done, it's interesting to note that where Maimonides was, he started out in Muslim Spain. He went for a brief time to Israel, and then he spent the remaining years in Egypt. So
yeah.
and he was very much rationalist. And from my understanding, that he was fully knowledgeable about the works of Aristotle. And you hadn't specifically mentioned Aristotle. Is that the case? That it was his knowledge of the Aristotelian
Yes,
ideas that made him such a rationalist?
these had been translated into Arabic, which he read. And so, yes, he had much more access to the classical world than,
Yes.
say, the Northern European rabbis
Yes.
did. There was Sephardic Judaism, what we now call Sephardic Judaism, the forerunner of that. Sfarad and Ashkenaz as entities were very different in those ways.
Yeah.
They were very different in the kinds of studies that they did. Sfarad, Bagel, including Northern Africa and the Middle East, you were not considered educated unless you knew, these works of classical philosophy and science. This was part of your study. In Ashkenaz, you studied Talmud. That is what you did. You learned scripture and then you studied Talmud. And that was considered enough, and anything else was considered a distraction. So, there was, of course, trade between Ashkenaz and Sfarad, and I think there was a little bit of cultural interchange from that, but, they really didn't see eye to eye on what an educated Jew was. They love Maimonides because he wrote this nice, simple thing, and of course there was like Rabbi Alfasi who condensed the halakhic conclusions of the Talmud and just wrote them all down, and it's codes. Just study the codes. You can get all that you need to know. And the Sephardi world became the great producer of codes, right up to the Shulchan Aruch, which was the Sephardi enterprise. Make that part of it simple. Let's not spend precious time puzzling that out of the text of the Talmud. Write it down. This is what it is. Okay, fine. Go apply that. And let's study the fun stuff. The classical sciences, your Aristotle, your Ptolemy, your all of those things. Write poetry, compose music, all of this lovely cultural stuff. So it's a much more complete man.
That's really so far-reaching, given today with the controversy about education of children of Hasids in New York.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, they kept kind of that old Ashkenazi, let's privilege the Talmud over everything else. And if we devote our lives to studying that will be the service of the God, and the rest of it will sort itself out. As opposed to becoming a broadly educated human being and participating in the things of the world and the universe. So, he goes on, and in that, along those lines, and his conclusion is basically astrology fed on that. But despite all of the cold water that Maimonides threw on the astrological idea, it kept hanging on. For example, it's described by the medieval commentator Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Aderet, Spain, 13th century, who's explaining a piece of Gemara extolling Abraham as the first to call God Lord, Adonai, or Adon, when Abraham asked God how he was to know that he would inherit the land of Canaan. So apparently, as we learned earlier, Abraham had bad mazal. And it is true that the constellations of the heavens have sway over the world, such that according to his mazal, a man may be rich or poor, that his days may be lengthened or cut short. He may be barren or fruitful, unless he inclines his mazal differently by his deeds. So this idea that, yeah, it's written there, but you can always get up there with your eraser and go to work on that. And Abraham, according to his mazal, was not destined to have children, except that he converted and went out from under the influence of the constellation of stars. The idea that the nations are under this, that, become a good Jewish person and you're not under this anymore. He raised himself up through his deeds and adhered to the higher cause of the Blessed Holy One, who is Lord of all. And the constellation could not nullify offspring from him. And as the sages said in Midrash, he took him outside and said, look, habait toward heaven, count the stars. They do not say habait except of the one who reaches out, shemabit, from above to below. For Abraham saw from his astrological chart that he would not father children. God said to him, go out from your astrology. Abraham will not father children, but Abraham will. And therefore, Abraham called the Holy One of Blessing Adon, Lord, because in this way, those of his generation, or those wise in astrology, would know that there's a Lord above them able to nullify their strength, and it would be known that God is the Lord who directs in his power, and there is no power over one who has adhered to the higher cause to counteract his strength and superiority. So God is on our side against all of those nasty stars. And he's quoting that midrash that we saw earlier about Abraham. So his pupil, Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher ibn Halawa, 13th, 14th century Spain, one who wrote a book of early Musar among his many other accomplishments. Elohei Nekar Haaretz, to Deuteronomy 31:16. After the gods of the foreigners, not to stray after the gods of the foreigners. But Torah tells us that such gods have been permitted to the Gentile nations were nonetheless strangers, Nekarim, in the Holy Land, as the land was always under the direct supervision of the Lord. This was the big difference between Israel and everywhere else. Everywhere else was governed by intermediaries, but God played with Israel, God's own self. This is also what the sages meant when they said, Ein Mazali Israel, the Jewish people are not subject to the horoscopic influences we know as Mazal. Israel's fate's not governed by the celestial planetary forces, as the planets, stars, and all the other celestial phenomena have been created for the sake of the righteous. And how could it possibly be that these same righteous people are suddenly subject to these horoscopic constellations? And it goes on to say that, each nation gets its own constellation. Scorpio is Ishmael for them. Sagittarius, the archer with Persia, were renowned as archers, by the way. This is what the Torah referred to in Deuteronomy, which he assigned to them, whereas he personally took you out of the iron crucible, etc. So clearly the supervision of the fates of the other nations by celestial forces has been entrusted to agents of the Lord, the horoscopic forces, whereas that of the Jewish people is not determined by means of intermediaries. And fleshing out this idea. So after this, Judaism pretty universally began to frown on astrology. Rambam was very influential in the Sephardic world and became very influential in the Ashkenazi world as well. And these other authorities, also not so down on this. Even the Shulchan Aruch was not approving of this. We do not inquire of astrologers or into our fates. That's Yosef Karo. Plain and simple. Don't do it. Not even once. Now, the Ramah, Joseph Isserles, who is the Ashkenazi authority, who was also trying to write the same code from an Ashkenazi standpoint, when he realized that Torah was doing so very well at it, decided instead to turn his work into a gloss on it so that Shulchan Aruch would be just as useful to Ashkenazi Jews as to Sephardic Jews. Added this comment, as it is written, you shall be pure before the Lord your God, and thus also it is forbidden to inquire of sorcerers, diviners, or witches. But even so, it's best not to take chances. His comment to the next section of the Shulchan Aruch was, insofar as a person knows that he is opposing Mazal, he should not do this and should not rely on miracles. Rather, he should not inquire into this in the first place, because of you must be wholehearted before the Lord your God, as is made clear, and he's citing a Teshuvah of the Rambam there. So, in other words, don't wake the dragon. Just don't go there. Despite all this grumpiness, astrology was still a thing, and now was even a thing in Europe. As more knowledge of the classical world was reacquired, it became more popular again in Europe, at least for illustrative purposes, into the 18th century at least. Now this was a book that was used as Sefer Evronot from Germany in the 18th century. It's a book having to do with a calendar and having to do with computing when dates should fall in the Jewish year. and whether to put in that extra Adar or not. So note that instead of associating gods with the planets as the Greco-Roman astrology did, Jewish thought associated angels with them. So here's angels and their different planets and their associated astrological signs on this page. There are 6 angels appointed over the 7 celestial bodies in the Mazalot. That's up at the top of the page there says. And the associations are from the top right: Michael, Mercury, Gemini and Virgo; Gabriel, the moon, Cancer; Hapsiel, Saturn; Capricorn and Aquarius, go with that; Zadkiel, Jupiter, Sagittarius and Pisces; Samael, who's the Malach HaMavis, you know, my patron saint there, who has Mars and the signs of Aries and Scorpio. So, hey, Malach HaMavis, here's a shout out to you. Raphael, the Sun, Venus, Leo, Libra, and Taurus. So Raphael has a lot to do. 2 planets and 3 signs. So there weren't enough planets to go around in those days. So there you go. We'll have to do double duty time. So what happened to astrology? You know, it's still around, and we all enjoy reading what's going to happen to people with the sign of this month, with our sign this month, and so on. Read the horoscope in the papers. It's cute. It's fun. But it doesn't occupy a place beyond curiosity in most of our lives. You know, we don't wrestle with the question of how the stars might affect our decisions. I mean, it was a real thing. What day should you start doing something on? The days were also associated with different angels. You know, the moon should be waxing when an enterprise starts. You know, all kinds of practical considerations like that people used to have that we just don't anymore. So modern authorities might discourage the practice of astrology, but you know, nobody cares if we read the horoscope in the paper. And a blog from Hebrew Union College, from which the previous illustration was taken as well, offers some insight here. In previous eras, the zodiac and the associated knowledge of astrology was understood as a part of the cycle of the natural world and was deeply intertwined with any reckoning of the celestial motions and the calendar. Jewish scribes did not shy away from its inclusion in religious works, and it was not seen as idolatrous or overly superstitious, but rather as a representation of the divine order of the heavens and of time. So what caused the Mazalot to disappear from Jewish symbolism in the European world beginning in the mid-19th century? One likely argument from Rabbi Geoffrey Dennis from HUC is that with the advent of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, the reverence for star signs fell out of style. As knowledge of secular sciences became more commonplace in the Jewish world, it could be that the validity of the zodiac as a reflection of any natural order was undermined, and its influence on world events less empirically evident. And so Jewish scholars relegated the star signs and their associated images to the category of superstition. According to Dennis, a collective decision was made that we would become the most modern, the most rational people in Europe. In a few decades in the 19th century, most Jews walked away from those traditional ideas, i.e. the Mazalot. While many in the current Jewish world do not hold much stock in Jewish astrology, Dennis does not dismiss those who still embrace belief in the Mazalot. Instead, he goes on to explain, we've also come to realize that human beings are not simply the epitome of rationality, and our lives are richer when we embrace mysteries. So there we go. We can embrace the mystery of the stars. We can appreciate the beauty of creation. We can even wish on them a little bit if we like. But we know that the workings of God are just so much more complicated than that. Or the workings of our source and the workings of creation just go far beyond where something is at the sky at a particular moment. But we can still appreciate the incredible intellectual effort that went into this for so long and gave us so many fascinating insights to what people of different ages were thinking when they looked up at the sky. So are there any final questions or observations that anybody would like to make on this hugely lengthy presentation?
I want to add that I think that the visual quality, the entertainment, the eye candy, the beauty is what still keeps it alive.
Mm. There's nothing quite like going out and looking at the night sky, a clear night in a place that's truly dark, that doesn't have artificial light. There's nothing quite like that experience. There's a reason why God said, come out of your tent and have a look at this, Abraham. Just appreciate how many of that there is up there. And there's going to be that many of you.
And this is an incredible presentation. I'm grateful to you for bringing this to us. It's absolutely splendid.
Well,
Yesh
thank you.
koach. Yeah, really yesh koach. Yes, incredible. And I want to spread the word and listen to it again and
Yes.
encourage other people to listen to it and watch it.
Well, it's been very interesting to research it and to share it with all of you. And hopefully we can do this again on some other topic, some other
We
time.
certainly want to do that.
Definitely.
Thank you, Anne. I'm definitely going to listen to this again. There was just too much to absorb this quickly, but it was fascinating.
Thank you.
And this because we record these things, it's an opportunity to share our excitement to those who are too busy today to tune in, because it'll be just as enjoyable